Hi, and welcome to day 1 of Photoshop Essentials. My name is Sylvia, and I'm going to be instructing you throughout the 4 days of this course, and today is going to be the very basics of Photoshop. So if you've never opened Photoshop before, this is the course for you. And if you have and you're familiar with the layout and interface and layer system of Photoshop, then you might want to move on to day 2 or just fast forward in this video. Okay, let's get started by going to a web browser and downloading our class files for today. If you don't have the link to these class files, go ahead and give us a call or email us to get that link. Okay, I'm just going to right click, hit download. I already have them downloaded though, so I'm going to navigate to that. Okay, this is what it looks like when you click on that zipped folder, and you'll want to extract all files. And now I'm going to browse for my desktop, just because I like having my photos there. Hit OK and extract. Okay, here are all the photos for today. We're going to start with this flower image, and there are 3 ways to open a photo in Photoshop. You can right click on the image and go to Open With and navigate to Photoshop from there, or you can go to Photoshop, File, Open, and open it in here, or my favorite way is to just click and drag it to Photoshop. There we go. Okay, so a lot of photo editing is problem solving. When you're looking at a photo and you'll notice that it's maybe too bright or too dark, maybe has too much blue in it, and you want to warm it up with some warmer tones. This picture has all this lint stuff in it that we'd want to get rid of. Do some spot removal there. So take a look at this photo and just think to yourself, what do I want to change? Okay, so I want to change the orientation as well, or not the orientation, but the rotation, because to me it's kind of upside down. So I'm going to flip it upside down and then get rid of this lint stuff and maybe change the brightness settings a little bit as well. And I also want these pinks and greens of the flower to pop out more, so I'll probably increase the saturation too. So these are all things we're going to learn today. It's going to be super fun, but the first thing that we have to do when we open anything in Photoshop is unlock our layer. So unlocking this layer will let us work with it more, but what we always want to do in Photoshop is make a copy of our base layer, our original photo, because we're going to make a lot of changes to this photo, and you always want to have your original as a backup in case you don't like the changes that you make. So to do that, we can right click, duplicate layer, that's one way, or I like to use a keyboard shortcut, Control J, or Command J if you're on a Mac. And that just makes an exact copy in your layers panel. So let's talk about the interface a little bit. This, like I just said, is our layers panel. Notice this tab that says layers. We're not going to delve into channels or paths, just stick to this layers panel. And as you noticed when we copied it, it put on a second layer, and that goes right on top. Okay, let's go all the way to the left of our window and look at these icons to the left. This is your toolbar. So Adobe has all these little icons and pictures for every tool, and it's kind of hard to understand what they do sometimes. So we're going to walk through a couple of them today and several of them within the next 3 days. And hopefully by the end of this course you'll feel comfortable with most of these tools here in our toolbar. Okay, as I change tools, you'll notice at the top here there's a control bar that changes according to what tool I'm clicked on. See how it's changing? That's because with every tool, you can further customize it with some of these options in here. So if I am on, let's see, this spot healing brush, I can change my brush size in here, and I can customize the tool I'm using. So you'll use this control bar a lot. Okay, I'm going to go back to my Move tool. And then at the very top we have our normal file menu, edit menu, stuff like that. So that is still here. So we can go to File Save or File Open. things that we're used to. If I open a new photo in here, it's going to go right next to this tab that says flower.jpg and open a new document. So you can have multiple documents in a single window. Super nifty. To the right, we have some more panel options. All of these icons represent a panel. So if I go here to my brushes panel, I'll see all my brushes. I'm not using the brush tool right now, so these aren't showing, but there we go. These are all my brushes that I can use. So if you want further options or customizations for tools, there's often a panel that goes with it. This is our character panel for typing. Has all kinds of customizations for that. Okay, so we've covered the layers panel, our extra panels over here, our toolbar, our control bar, and our menus at the top. Hopefully you feel comfortable with that. Your workspace, which is just a word to describe the way everything is laid out with the toolbar on the left and the panels on the right, can be changed. So right here where it says Essentials, I can actually change this to Photography, and that just made a really minor change with some of the tools to the left and the panels to the right. Because photographers don't deal with painting as much, there's no brush panel anymore, so it's just going to give you the tools that you need for photography. So that's kind of a nice thing to know as well. I'm going to be just in Essentials though. I like the default layout of Photoshop. Okay, let's edit this photo. The first thing I'm going to do is make sure that the top layer is selected. That's the layer that I want to work with, so I have to make sure it's highlighted that light gray so I know it's selected. And I'm going to flip it upside down. I'm going to make it rotate 180 degrees by going to Image, Image Rotation 180. There we go. That looks better. And now, I could do a number of things, but let's say I want to get rid of this lint stuff. This is the best tool ever. If you click on this little band-aid, it is your 7th tool down in the toolbar. That little band-aid is your best friend. It gets rid of blemishes, zits, scars, just things you don't want in your picture. All you have to do is change your brush size up at the top here by dragging this slider left or right, or if you want to know a cool shortcut, use your square bracket keys right by the letter P on your keyboard. The left square bracket will make it smaller and the right will make it bigger. You'll want your brush size to be just a tiny bit bigger than your blemish, and that just helps for accuracy when you're using the spot healing brush. Now you can click and it disappeared. Amazing, right? It just takes surrounding pixels that it thinks would do a good job of covering up your little blemish and fills in that spot that you select with those surrounding pixels, and it usually does a really fantastic job. So just go ahead and get rid of all those little spots by clicking on them. Okay, here's a piece that we might want to click and drag because it's kind of longer. So let's zoom in for accuracy. There are two ways to do this. Control plus will let you zoom, and you can just scroll with your scroll bars to the bottom and the right to the spot you want to go to. Or there's also a keyboard shortcut that I like. If you hold Alt or Option on your computer, on your keyboard, sorry, and then scroll with your scroll wheel, then you should be able to zoom that way as well. I am on a laptop, so that's not really going to work for me right now, but that's my favorite shortcut for zooming is Alt Scroll. And I actually lied, there's a third way. There's a zoom tool right here, but I don't hardly ever use that. I just use my keyboard shortcuts. Okay, I want to get rid of this guy, so I'm going to make my brush size a little smaller and just click and drag to paint over it, and that will get rid of it pretty good. So go ahead and get rid of all the little lint. Another shortcut while you're zoomed into something, if you hold spacebar, your cursor turns into a little hand, and if you click and drag, then your hand will let you pan to other parts of your image. Okay. We're just going to do a rough job, because I think you get the idea. And let's go on to another photo editing tool. So I'm going to hit Control 0 to go back to my zoomed out view of my photo. And now let's change the brightness. So I'm going to go to the bottom of my layers panel, and there's this little icon. It looks like a half moon. Well, it's a full moon, but it has half filled in and half not filled in. If you click on that, it shows you your adjustment layers. All these options are also going to be up in your layer menu. So if you click on layer and then new adjustment layer, those are all the same options we just saw. Another way to get there is by clicking adjustments right next to libraries. And that shows us all our adjustment layers. They're just in icon form, but when you hover over them, it tells you above what adjustment layer it is. So we actually want the curves adjustment layer. This is kind of a complicated adjustment layer, but it's super handy. So if you click on curves, notice that it added a new layer onto our layers panel. And if I click and drag this line up or down, it'll lighten or darken my photo. So up is lighten, down is darken. Awesome thing about this is you can selectively edit certain values of your photo. So if you look to the bottom and the left of this graph, it has like a grayscale going from black to white. This means that the values to our right and to the top over here are our highlights. That's why it's white. But if you notice the bottom left corner, this is black. And so these are our shadows. And because this flower was taken in front of a dark background, that's why in our little graph here, see how there's this peak? It's telling us that there are a lot of shadows in this photo. And then this little peak right here, just a tiny little peak, that is from the flower, because these are pretty bright values. So I'm just going to darken my shadows actually, and get rid of this weird fabric-y background altogether by darkening it. And now I just have a flower in front of a nice dark background. It also makes my colors pop a little more. In your layers panel, to see your image without certain layers, you can toggle the visibility by clicking on the little eyeball to the left of a layer. So I'm just going to click on this eyeball to see what it looked like before, and then click on it again to see the after. That looks great. Okay, so I'm going to just get rid of a couple more spots to the right over here that I have, and you'll notice when I try clicking, it's not going to work. This is because I'm selected on my curves layer, and I want to be selected on this layer 0 copy because that is where my actual lint specs are. They're not on the curves adjustment layer. So you always want to make sure that the right layer is selected. If you're working with a tool and it doesn't seem to be working, like 90% of the time, it's because you're on the wrong layer. Okay, that looks a lot better to me. Let's move on to a new document. If I go to my Day 1 Photos folder and open up this Pier 49 pizza, you'll notice that it's not a JPEG, so it's not showing us a thumbnail. It's just a PSD file, which is a Photoshop document. So if you double click on it, it should open up in a new document in Photoshop. There we go. We see that we have our first document here in the first tab and then our new one in the next tab. And if you go to your layers panel, you'll see a bunch of condiments that go on top of a pizza. I guess toppings would be a better word. Right now, We're only seeing the very bottom layer though, and you'll notice that all these eyeballs are poked out. The ones that we used earlier to toggle the visibility, they're all poked out, but if we click, it should bring up those layers, and if you click and drag through a bunch of eyeballs, then it'll turn all of them on or all of them off if you do it again. Okay, so let's say I don't like pineapple on my pizza, which is true, I don't. Then I would take off the visibility so that they're not on my pizza. Or if I really hate them and I just want to delete them, then I'll click and drag this whole layer to my little trash can in the bottom right of my layers panel, and that will delete it altogether. You usually don't want to do that unless you're really sure that you don't want that layer though, because it's destructive. It's going to actually delete that layer, whereas if you just turn off the visibility, it's still there in your layers panel, it's just not showing. So that's non-destructive editing. Okay, so go ahead and build your pizza, deleting the ones that you don't want and keeping the ones that you do. If you don't like the click and drag to the trash can thing, you can right click, delete layer, that also works. Or you can just hit delete on your keyboard as well. And this is just so that we get some layer practice. Okay, let's say you have all the condiments you want, but you want to rearrange them. So usually your bacon or your pepperoni is going to go on top, right? So you want to drag that to the top, and you can do that just by dragging that layer until you see that little white line, and that shows you that it's going to go to the top. Awesome. I'll want this extra cheese by my other cheese. Oh yeah, I want peppers on top, sausage on top, good. That's exactly how I want it. If I pulled my sauce to be on top, it's going to ruin everything. Super weird, see? So the order of your layers is really important as well. Okay, hopefully that was enough practice with layers that you feel more comfortable with how that works. It kind of works like transparencies on an old projector. My teachers used to use these old projectors, and they'd have transparencies that they could draw on with like whiteboard markers or something, and they would draw on the top layers, and then that would show to be on top, but anything below that was covered by their markings would not be showing up on the projector. And that's the same way with these layers. Whatever's on top is going to be showing first and foremost, and then anything that it's covering will not be showing. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let's open up a photo in Photoshop and practice with these layers. So I'm going to open up this baby Mia. Just drag it to Photoshop, and this time, instead of just plopping it right here, you'll want to plop it next to the tab that we just had in this gray space, because that will open a new document, whereas if I just drop it here, it's going to put it on top of my pizza. Okay, here is baby Mia. Now let's do some problem solving. We see some snot under her nose. We probably want to get rid of that. Let's see, we could brighten the contrast, or brighten the photo and up the contrast to make her eyes pop out a little more. We could also learn a couple new tools to brighten her eyes, make that blue come out. So what's the first thing we want to do? Control J, copy this layer. Okay, you also might want to unlock the bottom layer if you'd like, or you can leave it locked since we're not going to use that layer. Okay, now let's add an adjustment layer. So I'm going to add a curves layer like we did before. So before we came in here and picked it from this menu, but I'm going to show you this way. This full moon but half filled in with white icon is your adjustment layers. It's really the icon for brightness and or contrast, you know. But I'm going to click on curves, and then I'm going to increase my highlights a little bit. And then I also want to drop another point down here with the shadows and decrease those. And what that will do is actually increase contrast. because that's all contrast is changing the values of your shadows and your highlights. Let's see what that looks like without that adjustment layer by clicking the eyeball. Oh great, that improves it by a ton. Okay, now let's say I want to get rid of this snot. We've learned how to do this with the spot healing brush. So I would use that same tool, but I would make sure my layer 1 is selected. We don't want the curves layer to be selected because that's not going to affect the snot at all. I'm going to zoom in and try to get rid of this stuff. You might want to go a little bit at a time. If you do the whole thing all at once, it might be hard for Photoshop to know exactly what you want. Don't forget your keyboard shortcuts for making the brush size bigger or smaller using the square brackets on your keyboard. Get rid of all these little crumbs and specks on her face. Okay, that looks pretty good, so I'm going to zoom out again. And now let's learn a new tool to brighten her eyes. So these are destructive edits, which means that instead of making a new layer like this curves layer did, it's going to affect your actual pixels. And luckily we have this copy of our original at the bottom in our layers panel. So any edits we make, we can always get rid of by deleting this whole layer. But just to be safe, sometimes you'll want to Control J and duplicate the layer again so that you can make some destructive edits and then delete them if you don't want them. So I'm just going to make sure I have that copy, and then I'm going to go to my Dodge tool. And the Dodge tool looks like a lollipop. It's in your toolbar about halfway down, and what it will do is brighten pixels. So if I just make my brush a little bigger and go over her eyes, it's going to brighten them. Now I'll do the other eye. Those are a lot brighter, maybe a little too bright. But you can change the strength of this tool by going up to the control bar. Right now the exposure is at 50%. If you want it to be more subtle, you might want to bring it down with the slider. And notice that you have a range as well. You can just apply these changes to the shadows, or just brighten the midtones, or just brighten the highlights. So maybe over here with her left eye, which is our right, I want to change the shadows because that's what those values are right under her eyelid. They're kind of darker, so I'm going to try to brighten those. And now it's only affecting the shadows. Okay, now we have the opposite of that tool, which darkens things, and that is your burn tool, right below the dodge tool. So whenever you see a little triangle in the bottom right corner of these tools, that means that there are more tools within that icon. So if I right click, it'll show me the rest of the tools. So the burn tool is within that icon, and if I click on that, it's going to do the opposite. Now I'm not sure exactly what I would want to burn in this photo. Let's see, maybe I would burn the eyelashes to bring him out a little more because she has very light eyelashes. I wouldn't normally do this to a child. I would do it to an adult, I guess, because you kind of want to have that eyeliner or mascara look or whatever. But I would probably change the range here to shadows because her eyelashes are shadows, and then also decrease my exposure so it's not quite so strong. Okay, let's see what this does. That's still a pretty strong effect. I might bring that down a little more. Change my brush size a little bit. Going over her eyelashes. It's kind of just making it look like she has makeup. So again, this is not really a practical use that I would do it on for a little baby, but that is the burn tool. It darkens pixels. So those are good tools for adjusting exposure selectively. Just always remember that they're destructive, so you'll want to have a copy of the layer. So now if I don't like the burning and dodging, I can just turn this layer off and it won't be there. So that's how you do non-destructive editing. Okay, kind of freaky what we did with her eyes, but let's move on to a new photo. Let's do this bold red eye. So I want to show you how to get rid of red eye, even though with most cameras nowadays we don't really deal with red eye as much because the cameras have gotten good enough that they don't have that flaw. But let's go ahead and get rid of it just so you know how. There's a red eye tool. It should be within your spot healing brush. If you right click on it and go to the very bottom, there's the red eye tool. Now don't forget to copy this layer, Control J, and if you just click on his red eye, it should get rid of it. Sometimes it doesn't do a great job like right now. There we go. So you'll have to just try clicking in different spots on the red eye. There we go. Still kind of didn't do a fantastic job, but generally with most images it'll do a great job of just zapping that red eye and getting it out of there. So that is the red eye tool. Let's move on to another photo. Let's do underexposed. So with this photo, I want to teach you a couple more exposure changing options, exposure editing options. So if I copy this layer, Control J, and I go to my adjustment layers, notice that they're kind of split into groups. These three are in the first group, and then the next group has 4 adjustment layer types in it. There's brightness and contrast, levels, curves, exposure. And these 4 have to deal with exposure, and that's why they're in their own group. So go ahead and click on brightness and contrast. And I can just click and drag this slider where it says brightness to brighten her up. And then I can increase the contrast also. And this is a lot simpler than the curves tool, which I showed you earlier, which also means that it's not as good for getting those fine details and selectively editing for certain values. Okay, let's go to another one. We have levels and exposure. Let's do exposure. So this, if we increase the exposure, will just brighten it up a lot. That's another way to brighten and darken your photo. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's add another adjustment layer. It's called the color balance adjustment layer, and if we click on that, we'll see all these colors: cyan, red, magenta, green, yellow, blue. Basically, if there's too much of one color in your photo, you can just drag this slider to the opposite color, and that will bring in that opposite color, reversing the effect of the other color that you don't want. So, for example, in this picture we have a lot of blue tones. That makes it kind of a cool photograph, whereas we want to have it a little warmer, so we want some more yellow tones. So I'm just going to drag this slider a little bit towards the yellow and just kind of see to what point I want to go just by dragging the slider. And let's say I like that. That looks a lot better, I think. Now you might notice there's a little green in her hair, so I might want to move this towards magenta. Let's see what that does. Oh, but then her skin looks a little too purpley. That's not good, so I'll just tone that down a lot. And then I might even push this one towards red because cyan is close to blue, and there was a lot of blue in this photo. Okay. That looks a lot better, I think. So if I turn off this layer and then turn it back on, see the difference? So that's your color balance. You'll start to notice in your photos, oh, this is too cool, or ooh, this is too warm, I want to cool it down. And you'll always want to come to this color balance adjustment layer to fix that. Okay, that looks a lot better. Let's go on to one more photo. Let's do white dog. I'm going to bring this into Photoshop, and I'm going to copy my layer, Control J. Now, this also looks a little cool. If you look at the dog up close here, and look at this boy's hair, it's kind of bluish, and his hair is not supposed to be blue, and this dog's fur is not supposed to be blue. So what that means is the color balance needs to be changed so that it's a little more warm. So I'm going to add my color balance adjustment layer again, and drag this towards yellow. Now it's looking a little too green, so I might make it more magenta, just a little bit. And then play with my red slider till I like what I see. Oh, that looks a lot better, I think. Let's see what that looks like. Awesome. And then the nice thing about this is, since it's non-destructive editing and it's on this separate layer, we can always go back in and change these values just by dragging the sliders. So it's always there for re-editing if you need to. Okay, now what else might we do to this photo? Let's say I want to bring out the colors more, so his bandana I want to be more green. I would just go to my adjustment layers icon and select hue saturation. And if you just increase the saturation a little bit, your colors should pop. You don't want to go too far because then it starts to look like this, and that's obviously too much. We can also try out a different layer that does a similar thing, so I'm going to turn this one off actually and show you another one. If I go to my adjustment layers and select vibrance, I can increase the vibrance, and it's a lot like saturation, but it'll try to keep your skin tones and more natural tones normal and not oversaturated. So I think it's more subtle, and usually it's a lot better than the saturation layer. Okay, let's see what that looks like. Okay, that does a pretty good job. Let's move on to the final thing we're going to learn today, which is saving. So I know we didn't get to that final photo. You can go and edit this in your own time. You've learned all the tools you need with the spot healing and the color balance and brightness and such. So go ahead and do that if you'd like, but I'm going to finish up here by saving this document. I'm going to go to File, Save. Now the default is a PSD file, which is a Photoshop document, and that will keep all your layers. See how this layers box is selected? That means that all these layers in your layers panel will still be there and you can still make edits. So that's a good thing to do if you've worked really hard and you want to keep this file for further editing. But I just want to save this as a JPEG. Let's say I'm done. I'm going to click Save as Type, change it to JPEG. I would just change this to a different name, so I'll put a edit after it because I edited it. And then I'll go Save, and it'll ask me the quality I want. So right now it's at 10. That's a pretty good quality actually. Anything above 8 is high quality, so I would just leave it at 10 and then keep this as baseline standard, that's fine, and hit OK. And now it's saved as a JPEG. So now I have it saved and I can close out of it, and it's going to ask me if I want to save a PSD file, but I don't really need to for now, so I'm going to say no and it'll close. So thank you for watching day 1. That's all we had for you today, and if you have any questions or you want some help, feel free to come up to the 4th floor of the library by the Multimedia Lab, where we are always waiting to answer your questions or help you with your projects.